First, I just want to thank you all for coming, but also thank especially our partners at Catholics at Booth who have made this possible today. My name is Michael Le Chevalier. I am the Senior Associate Director here at the Lumen Christi Institute. If you're not familiar with Lumen Christi, our mission is to make the Catholic intellectual tradition in its depth, breadth, and variety a living dialogue partner here at the University of Chicago. And it's hard not to think of a program, an initiative that does that dialogue better than our programming in economics and Catholic social thought that Mary has been involved with for, I don't know how many years now. Over a decade. So, Catholic social thought is, of course, the church's tradition of thinking about political society, thinking about moral economy, and invites from its earliest period the dialogue with secular philosophy and then with the social sciences. So it's exciting. As I already mentioned, today's event stands in a long tradition of programming that we've engaged with here at the University of Chicago, bringing economics in conversation with Catholic social thought. And over the years, that's featured speakers ranging from Robert Lucas, Roger Meyerson, Luigi Zingales, Oliver O'Donovan, Mary Hirschfeld, Joe Kabowski, Valerie Ramey, and more. That's a smattering of our theologians, our professors. And we have some friends in the audience who've participated over the years, Paul Weithman coming in from Notre Dame. And so just incredibly grateful that we can return to the University of Chicago with this important program. This program wouldn't be made possible without the partners who help make it a success. Credo, which is the Guild of Catholic Economists that has been the community that has sort of helped foster and continue this conversation in economics and Catholic social thought. Credo is Catholic Research Economist Discussion Organization. I believe the term is a backronym for that. We found our way back into that acronym from that title. Catholics at Booth, our co-sponsors for today's program, and the John Templeton Foundation, who made possible the support of this through the In Lumine Supporting the Catholic Intellectual Tradition on Campuses nationwide grant. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce both of our speakers today. We have first Mary Hirschfeld, who is Associate Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. Mary holds a PhD in economics from Harvard and a PhD in theology from the University of Notre Dame. I don't know if there's anyone else in the U.S. who can have that same claim to fame. She works at the boundary between both of those disciplines, specifically by developing an approach for economics that is grounded in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas with applications to questions of consumption, economics, economic justice, the common good, the nature of practical reason, and economic methodology. Mary also teaches every year the seminar that we host alternating between Notre Dame and Rome and Jerusalem, our seminar for economists, a primer in economics and Catholic social thought. She joins a host of other teaching team members for that. And she is the author of Aquinas and the Market Toward a Humane Economy, available for sale wherever books are sold. And we are posting a link online for folks who are joining to be able to purchase that. Following Mary's remarks, we'll also have a response by my neighbor, and I'm so grateful that he's here today, and professor here at the Booth School of Business, Professor Amir Sufi, who is the Bruce Lindsay Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He serves as an associate editor for the American Economic Review, the Journal of Finance, the Quarterly Journal of Economics. He was awarded the 2017 Fisher Black Prize by the American Finance Association, given biennially to the top financial economists, economic scholars under the age of 40. Professor Sufi's research focuses on finance and macroeconomics, and his research on household debt and the economy forms the basis of his book co-authored with Atif Mian, House of Debt, How They and You Caused the Great Recession, and How We Can Prevent It from Happening Again, that was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2014. He earned a PhD in economics from MIT, where he was awarded the Solo Endowment Prize for graduate student excellence in teaching and research. And I can say that sitting in on a panel, it feels like maybe 6 or 7 years ago, in which Professor Sufi was speaking on questions of inequality and engaging with questions of religion, and speaking on how these questions are addressed from a Muslim perspective, actually changed how I taught business ethics at DePaul, enabling me to sort of bring in these really interesting questions of how risk is allotted within the Muslim community. So I'm grateful as a professor for the way in which your work and your research has also impacted my students. Please join me in welcoming Mary to the stage.
First of all, thank you all for coming out tonight. This is a short version of a paper I wrote back before the pandemic, but I hope the issues still seem live to me, and it always seems like a good subject to bring up to a public audience. So the question is, the title of the paper is Rethinking Economic Inequality, a Theological Perspective. And this was actually a paper that was originated in a group that I worked with Paul Weithman. He organized a group of us to write about economic inequality. And at the time when we were starting to do that work, it was in the mid to late, it was around 2014, 2016, in that era. And economic inequality was at that time a live, hot topic. In April of 2014, Pope Francis had tweeted out that inequality is the root of social evil. But in doing so, he was only adding his voice to a chorus of, at the time, secular concern about rising economic inequality in advanced nations around the world. That same year saw the publication of Thomas Piketty's best-selling treatise on economic inequality, Capital in the 21st Century. And Piketty was not alone. In the years following, several prominent economists from both the left and the right published books on the moral crisis that seemed to have afflicted our economic order. And then politically, it had an impact. The 2016 relative success of Bernie Sanders is unintelligible apart from that issue. So from the point of view of a theologian or a Christian, the question is, given that economic inequality already has standing in secular discussions, what does Christian ethics have to contribute to contemporary debate? And that question has even more bite if you turn to Scripture. Because if you turn to the Bible, it turns out that there's two main principles about economics you'll find in the Bible. Number one, don't be overly obsessed with wealth. It's hard for the rich guy to get to heaven, and a lot of concerns about excessive materialism. And number two, perhaps even more overwhelmingly, you must be concerned with the poor. But it seems that our contemporary concerns have reversed the priorities. The debates aren't so much about whether there's too much poverty in the US. They seem to be worried about the rich having too much stuff and putting a gap between the rest of us. Okay, so in this talk, I want to take up the question of what specific theological concerns we should bring to the topic of economic inequality apart from the well-developed Christian concern about poverty itself. Excuse me, did I misspeak? We should bring to the topic of economic equality apart from the concern about poverty. The talk has three parts. First, I want to warn against just entering into secular debates about the subject in order to take sides. Christians often think that the people pushing for more egalitarian stuff must be on the Christian team because we care about the poor. But in doing so, they embrace secular positions that are founded around assumptions that I think are actually theologically problematic. But worse, those assumptions, if left unchallenged, I'm going to argue, might well be part of building up a culture that inevitably will produce more inequality. Okay, the second part of the talk, I will develop this theological perspective that invites us to think about economic inequality in a different way. And it centers on the proposition that in order to think about it well, we have to first think about what is the nature of society, but we also have to think about what role does wealth really play in a good and flourishing human life. Okay. In the last section of the talk, which is briefer, I'll talk about what difference it would make if we adopted the approach that I'm advocating here. Okay. So part one. What's wrong with approaching the topic of income inequality from a secular point of view? I'm going to try to do briefly the first one. This is just a sort of standard take. There's a lot of people in the world, both theologians but also non-economists, who think that our economic debates are about substantive moral disagreements. So they think that the people advocating for minimum wages are in favor of equality and concern for the poor, and the people who are against minimum wages are in favor of freedom or growth or something, and that there's a moral disagreement between the two. And there is some of that. I don't want to discount it altogether. There's definitely a moral disagreement underlying these things. But from an economist point of view, a lot of these debates are, we all actually agree about what we want. We want to have prosperity for everybody. We want it to be equitably shared. The debates line up around technical, quasi-technical, but economic and political arguments about how does it actually play out. So going back to the minimum wage, the people who are against it might often be people who are deeply concerned about the plight of the working poor. Their concern might be something like a higher minimum wage would cause more unemployment and make them worse off. Okay. All right. So I could say more about that, but we'll move on, because I want to go to the second danger, and it's the one that worries me most because it's most insidious. The thing that worries me is that the secular concern about economic inequality are rooted in some assumptions about the nature of the individual vis-a-vis society and the role of material wealth in a happy life that are problematic from a Christian point of view. To see this, I take up the case of John Rawls, who's one of the most influential philosophers advocating for something that looks like redressing the problem of economic inequality. So this is a simplified version of how I understand Rawls. Rawls argues that fairness arises as an essential aspect of social justice because of the nature of the social problem. Okay, what's the social problem? On the one hand, individuals agree to become members of a society because the collective output we have together as a society is greater than what any individual could pursue on their own. I am going to be able to live a lot better off as a member of society than I could possibly do if I were out in the woods trying to build a cabin on my own. And because of that, I want to enter into society so that I can have a better standard of living. But once we've made this contract, that leads us to the problem of we've collectively, through the miracle of division of labor and trade and all the rest, generated all this prosperity. How are we going to divide up the spoils? How are we going to divide up the goods? Okay. So Rawls, in thinking about how we're going to divide up the goods, recognizes that a perfectly egalitarian distribution of income would probably lead to a poor society all around. So he hears economists saying incentives matter, and he recognizes that if we got rid of all inequality, probably a lot of people would wake up in the morning going, well, maybe I work, maybe I don't, and then we're all worse off. So he develops a principle that says that the fair society is the one in which the least well-off person is as well-off as possible. Okay, it's called a mini-max principle. So in other words, we should tolerate inequality only to the point where it enhances the well-being of that poorest person. Okay, and given the basic assumptions, I don't think it's a bad approach. On the one hand, he's giving due to the economic instinct that economic freedom is good for general productivity and wealth, and at the same time, he's maintaining a real serious concern about the people at the bottom. But let's take a closer look at the backdrop assumptions in this position. First, we are primarily individuals. The whole reason we entered into society was because we wanted to be better off. And then we're going to conceive of fairness of thinking about how does each individual fare with this bargain, right? So we're thinking about everybody as a bunch of individuals. And then we're going to pause and think about, well, I want to make sure it's fair. And Rawls has a really interesting mechanism for trying to motivate the idea that once I've entered into this contract, I should actually be worried about the welfare of the person at the bottom, because in some other draw, I might have been that person. And that's why I want to construct a world that way. Okay. If you were to come at this from a Christian point of view, or even a more pre-modern point of view, the concept of society is just deeper, and it's kind of where my own work is right now. It's an organic view of society. So we as human beings have an intrinsically social aspect to ourselves. We like hanging out together. My conversations with you enhance my well-being and vice versa. In fact, I could not really understand myself apart from the roles I play as a sister, a daughter, a mother, a teacher, whatever these things are. Our lives are shot through with relationship. And given that, we're going to be inclined, we should be naturally be inclined to care about the welfare of the people with whom we are in these relationships. So it's a more organic understanding of why we should care. To give a secular example of somebody who spies this problem, Robert Putnam ran a New York Times piece called Our Kids, describing the world back when he was growing up in Ohio in the 1950s. And the upshot of that was, back then, everybody in the town he was growing up in, they all went to the same school. All the kids went to the same school. And so the richer families had their kids in the school, and the poorer families had their kids in the school. And if there was some kid who was promising from the bottom, the poorer side of this community, everybody would band together to help make sure that kid had a leg up, right? So the rich people would offer scholarships to help that person make their way. And as the title of the piece suggests, the reason they did that is because they thought of the kids in the school as our kids. There's a sense of communion there. Okay. Okay. The second backdrop assumption that Rawls is employing is that what matters for individual flourishing is material resources. Rawls's deep worry is that each individual should have as good as possible a shot at realizing his or her own dreams. And we don't have enough consensus in a pluralistic society about what those dreams should be, but we can all make sure that everybody has the means to pursue whatever dreams they happen to have. So the essence of fairness, as I understand it, is that there's a fair distribution of economic resources. But behind this is the idea that what really matters at the end of the day is the money. In conversation about economic inequality, especially one that's bracketing the problem of poverty to focus on the question of just the disparity, this is a real problem. Should anybody who's morally concerned be really worried if some people are super rich while other people are only a little bit rich? Okay. The danger of the secular discussion of income inequality is that it buys into the idea that the problem with Bill Gates having billions is that he's hogging too much of the pie. And what's lost is the idea that having billions might not be good for anybody. Okay. So the Bible and the church traditions have long warned against the idea that wealth leads to happiness. And just to be clear, everybody needs some wealth, right? The question is whether having more of it is necessarily helpful. And the spiritual tradition is it's a trap. People who are rich have a lot of anxiety about making sure they're hanging on to their money. The money is kind of a substitute for their reliance on God. Because they're so busy with these concerns and kind of caught up in this rat rate, they're more likely to not notice the needs of their human neighbors. And they're probably going to be a little bit more individualistic. And as a result, they're losing a major source of human fulfillment, which is participation in society. Okay. St. John Chrysostom puts it this way. He asks, what is the definition of wealth? And you might think that the definition of wealth is the person who has the most money. But he says, and he's drawing on ancient traditions, not just Christian, that the definition of wealth is the wealthy person is the person who has what they need, right, and who's happy with what they have. And by that definition, the billionaire who's busy sweating getting the next billion is actually poor because they feel a want. Okay. So I used this example earlier this morning, but I'll do it again. From this point of view, wealth is an instrumental good that helps us fulfill what we need. And like any instrumental good, you only need it to the point that it serves its purpose. And the analogy that the ancients would draw would be between wealth and medicine. Okay? And it's easy to see the issue when you're talking about medicine. If it takes 2 aspirin to cure a headache, then what everybody needs is 2 aspirin. And then you have to ask, you could imagine a society debating the equitable distribution of aspirin. And if the debate was between some people having 10 aspirin and other people only having 8, okay, in a world where you only need 2, you can see that we're missing something important in this conversation. Okay. By uncritically entering into secular conversations, Christians and other people from these kinds of perspectives risk validating these faulty modern assumptions. And as I'm going to argue later on, I think it's these assumptions that actually drive the economic inequality in the first place. Okay, that said, and I don't think I've made this clear yet, I actually think inequality in our country is a serious problem that's been growing. I'm 62, I've seen it grow over my life. It's changing the world. There are real reasons to be concerned, so we should ask what might those be. Okay, so the Pope, going back to his tweet about inequality is the root of all evil, if you go and read his actual writings, he's going to isolate two particular phenomena that he's worried about. He writes an awful lot about an overly market-driven society that excludes the people at the bottom, excludes them. And the second thing he worries about is that it also tends to exploit them, so exclusion and exploitation. I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about my understanding of what a well-ordered economy looks like from a theological point of view. This is drawing on the material I develop in my book, and it comes out of the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay. One way to think about it is just to look at what Aquinas says about private property. This should give you a sense of how things flip around. For Aquinas, God gave us the world in common. But unlike a lot of his predecessors, Aquinas thought that private property is a perfectly fine fulfillment of natural law. It's in keeping with God's intention for the world. It's not just a concession to we're fallen after Adam and Eve, and so we need to have private property. He arrives at this conclusion by distinguishing between two ways we can view private property. We can think of it with respect to its productive uses, or we can think about it as a source of income for consumption. He thinks that from the first perspective, private property is a good thing. It is fitting for us to work for ourselves, and, and private property harnesses that impulse. It prevents us from quarreling, and it is fitting to our finite nature. The image that I have from this is that we look out into the world we hold in common, and we also see that by socially dividing labor, we could make things better off for ourselves. And we just wonder who should do what? How should we divide up all of this work? And private property is a way of assigning ourselves what sphere of creation are we supposed to be working on. And notice I flipped it around to being this is more my responsibility of what I do to contribute to the common good. Okay. But I'm also fulfilling my need to take care of myself and my family first. Okay. But then Aquinas says, with respect to use of consumption, when we think about our private property, we should hold it as if it were in common, namely ready to share with others. Okay. This was a big turning point in my life because I love Aquinas and I'm reading this along, and as an economist I'm like, wait a minute, how did you not just fall into a major contradiction here? If one of the reasons to have private property is because it will harness my desire to work for myself and enjoy the spoils of my own effort, and then you tell me, but at the same time I'm supposed to treat it as though it belongs to everybody else, why am I not back to that incentive problem where nobody's going to do any work? And the trick to seeing what Aquinas is up to is to notice that his idea about that incentive to work for yourself, he's got in mind the person who only works up to the point where they have what they need, right? So I go out and I plow my field and I feed my family and I'm really happy about that. And then if I have a good crop, I now have a windfall because that excess I don't need for myself because I've got the right view of the aspirin. I have my 2 aspirin and I'm ready to share the rest. Okay. Okay. A second example of the kind of flip Aquinas would invite you to is how do we think about the value of trade and commerce. The modern way of thinking about it might be that the reason I go into commerce is because I want to make a living, I want to make a profit, and if I look around in the market and I see there's a need for bread, I might start baking some bread in order to sell it to you and get some money. Okay. But for Aquinas, who always wants to put wealth in the place of the servant and think about the real goods, he's going to flip it around. Okay, I look out into the world and I see that I have a talent for baking and that my neighbors could use some bread. And so I start baking some bread. And then through the activity of baking bread, which is my primary activity, I'm happy to make a living, right, for myself. If you were in a world that was deeply formed by this kind of approach to economics, so what do I want to say? It would be a lot easier to take care of the people who were less fortunate, because those of us who had occupations that happened to return a lot more would know how much we need. We'd have a surplus, and it would be available to share for others. In the world that we live in which we think that getting more money is always better and the primary purpose of working and doing business is to make money, Rawls might persuade me that I should care, I should care about a fair distribution. But if he succeeds in persuading me to do that, I'm going to think of it as a sacrifice, right? Coming out of what I would otherwise be happy to be spending on myself. Okay. And I'm going to argue that that might well make it a little bit harder for people to actually engage in practices that would even things out. Okay. All right. With that background picture in mind, let's look at Francis's two concerns. Number one, the problem of exclusion. Biblical condemnations of excessive wealth are in fact often tied to admonitions to care for the needy. But alongside that, there is a concern that wealth not be used as a social wedge. In a world such as our own, at least in the advanced countries, where material needs are largely met, wealth often plays a major role. The major role of wealth often has to do with marking out status. And on Francis's view, this concern about social distinction often works by excluding those who are low on the ranks. There is a long intellectual history of thinking that the primary problem with greed is primarily a problem of invidious status seeking. That in fact our excessive materialism is not so much that we want to have big fancy houses with jacuzzis, it's that we want to think that we're more important, better than, or higher than our neighbors. St. Catherine of Siena identifies the vice of greed with the vice of using wealth for status seeking. In secular sources, we see the same thing. Bernard Mandeville, writing in the 17th century, argues that in England of his day, all that drive for commerce and industry is primarily driven by vices, specifically the vices of vanity and pride. So the banker who's working really hard, he's not doing that to make a lot of money. He's doing that because his wife is nagging him, because the wife needs to have enough money to buy this fancy hat with more plumes so she can make her neighbors feel pea green with envy. He's pretty funny, the way he breaks that down. But Adam Smith took this up in a more sober way in his theory of moral sentiments. And in other versions of this talk, I make people listen to a whole paragraph of it because I love the way Adam Smith writes. But the upshot of it, he says, is what is all this toil and bustle? Why is everybody running around trying so hard to make money and to advance on the economic ladder? He says, it's all for the distinction. Because if you actually look at the people, everybody's fed, everybody has a house, right? Everybody's more or less got what they need. Why do we people scramble for wealth? Because we cannot help but look at the wealthy people with admiration. Whenever a wealthy person comes in, we can't help but pay attention to them, and that's what people want. And the flip side of that is we're terrified of poverty because poverty is the reverse. Nobody sees the poor. We don't see them, or if we do see them, we might see them with contempt. They are people who have failed somehow. Okay. John Ruskin, another person who is kind of unsettled by the development of capitalism, offers an even darker take about the status seeking that's involved in wealth getting. For Ruskin, he says, if you actually think about the kind of wealth people are pursuing by working so hard to become investment bankers and the like, what they really want is they want to be able to hire a whole bunch of servants. They want to have people who can be their chauffeurs and their nursemaids and all the rest. They want to have command over other people. But think about this. If we lived in a society full of millionaires, the billionaires would not possibly be able to hire anybody to come in and clean out their toilets. Our pursuit of wealth is in large measure a pursuit of getting the ability to command the effort and time of other people, to shift the whole economic order towards ourselves. And if any of these accounts are right, I want you to notice that a lot of our pursuit of wealth is in fact a zero-sum game. To feel wealthy and to enjoy my wealth, it seems like I need to have more than you do. And I might be primed to create a circumstance in which that's the case. Increasingly in our culture, the status game is not played out simply in economic terms. In a recent book, not so recent anymore, The Sum of Small Things by Elizabeth Currid Halkett, she observes increasingly that the wealthy are not so much buying these big, huge mansions, although some of them clearly are. What they are doing is they're shopping at Whole Foods and scorning the bumpkins like me who actually do think that iceberg lettuce is better than arugula. They spend a lot of money to move to expensive school districts. so that they can give their kids a leg up on a competition. And this competition, again, speaking to my long life in the academy, is getting more and more severe, right? Our kids in schools like Chicago, schools like Notre Dame, they've been working their whole lives to get into Notre Dame because they absolutely have to be on the right side of the social line. It's really, really important to them, okay? And they're lining, and the very rich are also lining up their retirement funds. All of this maintains social distance, and it excludes those who have either don't have desire or access to upscale foods, quality education, or financial planners. And I want to say this because a lot of times we worry about the very, 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 very rich, the 1% of the 1% at the very top, as being part of the problem of economic inequality in our country. And they are a problem. There's real problems there. But I also want to call out that there's a real problem about the gap between the top 20% and the rest of the country, which seems to me socially and materially and politically is widening. Okay. So that means that I'm kind of asking us to all look at ourselves, because I think we're all more or less in that top 20%. Are we laughing at the people who eat at Cracker Barrel? Would we be horrified if our daughter came home and said, "Mom, I don't want to go to college, I want to become a plumber"? If we fall into those patterns of thought, we're maintaining a social climate that excludes the people who do eat at McDonald's or who do work as plumbers. There are increasing barriers between the classes. Okay. Robert Putnam, after having described Ohio in the 1950s, goes back to that town, and the rich people have now moved across into a gated community, and they have a separate school for their kids, and the kids on the other side of the track are left to their own devices. Okay, so that's the problem of exclusion, which strikes me as being alive and well in a modern America. Exploitation. The unbridled pursuit of wealth makes dehumanizing practices more tolerable. Okay, so I have a strong social desire to make as much money as I can so that I can be on the right side of the social distinction line. And I might start saying things like people did start saying in the 1990s and 2000s, that greed is actively good because greed is what gives us more productivity and makes things go. This is the heart of what Pope Francis is worried about, it seems to me. The drive to manifest success through accumulation of income leads to practices that might actively harm the poor and the marginalized. And I have in mind here not so much just the people working in the sweatshops in Vietnam so that we can all have our nice clothing at cheap prices, although that's certainly there. It's easy to point to a lot of those things. There's an awful lot of business that preys on consumers directly for the sake of shoring up a bottom line somewhere. I very, very often cite a book by Natasha Dow-Schul called Addiction by Design. She's an anthropologist, and I recommend everybody to read this book. It's an anthropological take on the industry in Las Vegas of building those poker video gaming machines where you put your quarter in and then you maybe get a flush and you get some money back. Okay. It's completely fascinating. The casinos in Las Vegas are designed as a maze so you will come in and not be able to go out. They are designed without windows or clocks so you will lose track of time. The machine itself is designed, and by the way, this is true about your computer video games and stuff, to hit the right music, to hit the right bells and whistles to keep you kind of addicted. They have studied the payout structure like crazy to figure out what payoff structure will keep you locked into the machine for that steady decline in the wealth as you play out over time. They hand the customers loyal customer cards that you plug into the machine. And the real purpose of those cards is so that they can track how you're doing. And if you're in a bad streak and about to give up, somebody will show up with cocktails or maybe even a bag of chips to keep you locked into that machine. The whole thing is designed to keep people in the machine. 90% of us can go in, play for an hour, walk away, and be happy. The whole industry is designed for that 10% who will get locked in. Okay. Do we recognize that sort of thing as immoral? It's exploitative in the extreme. It's a business model that requires destroying 10% of your customers in order to flourish. Okay. Well, I'm here to tell you that we are all sort of complicit in this. If you are trying to earn some returns on your investment portfolio so you can have your nice, comfortable retirement, you're putting pressure on Wall Street to maximize those returns. And the people trying to maximize those returns will be very creative in how to deliver. And that will include industries like the one that Natasha Dow-Schul is talking about. There's a great book by Akerlof and Schiller called Fishing for Fools that argues that a surprisingly large percentage of our economic activity is devoted towards more benign, but still in the same direction of what that gaming industry is doing. Okay, the bottom line of everything that I've had to say here goes as follows. If we all accept the proposition that all else equal, more money is better, along with the background assumption that society is just a contract that serves individuals, and you throw in the human tendency to use material wealth to mark out invidious social distinctions, we have a recipe for people actively pursuing excessive wealth. That is to say, actively creating inequality. And in doing so, they will tend to subordinate humane considerations to the profit motive and will fall into outright exploitation. This argument tracks secular arguments. The theological contribution is simply to affirm that we are brothers and sisters before the Lord, leaning back against the human tendency to atomize and compete for success. It's also to remind us that wealth has its place in a good life, but it's not God itself. It's to not make money an idol. In other words, it's an argument that well, basically, from this Christian perspective, it would say that the secular arguments about the problem of economic inequality rest on the very assumptions that are generating the problem. Okay, so let me close with the third part, some implications of this analysis or this line of thinking. Number one, we really have had a big rise in economic inequality in advanced nations over the last several decades. And there's a lot of economic research into, is it globalization? What's going on? Is it because the way tech industry works? What's going on with that? And I don't want to discount it. That's all important. But I think we should at least ask whether cultural shifts have been a part of the story. And what I have in mind are things like an article that appeared in the New York Times, an op-ed piece by a guy whose name I do not recall. He had worked at Goldman Sachs for a long time. And his article was about why he was resigning from Goldman Sachs. It came out around the time of the financial crisis. And he says, when I first started, we thought our job was to help our clients to allocate their resources well so that they could achieve their financial needs, whatever they were. We were in service of them. He says, but for the last decade or so, the culture has changed, and it's now all about how can we get money from our clients any way possible. So he resigned. Okay. I myself have noticed that in the 1970s, the ambitious person in college wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, which is about producing or serving something for people. It is now overwhelmingly the case that our students want to go into finance somehow, a large percentage of them. I just started at Mendoza. Something like 20% are doing management, 50% are in finance. And that seems to be driven by the idea that that's where the big money is. People are after the big money. So it seems to me that we should actually, in trying to think about what's causing this rising income inequality, we should be looking not just at the economic trends, but also the social trends and the cultural trends. Something seems to be going on out there that I think would be worth thinking or looking into and trying to find out. The second implication I have, maybe I'm going to flip them. The third implication I have is, sure, we can pursue programs to redistribute wealth. We can try to come up with policies that would allow people to compete better or whatever. But I am going to argue that we should also be looking very hard at trying to change the culture. And that has to do with changing our own hearts and the way we see things. So, for example, when confronted with the problem of economic inequality, a lot of people in situations like ours will say, well, what we really need to do is try to make sure that everybody has access to Chicago or Notre Dame or Harvard, right? And that would make things more equitable somehow. Okay, but I want you to notice that that's just pushing the problem down at back. I'm completely in favor of creating an educational system so that anybody from whatever background could pursue their dreams. If they're an architect or potential neurosurgeon, they should get these high-class educations. But if I put all my hope for making things fair on that, I'm still allowing us to all look down our noses at the plumbers and the mechanics and the people doing the rest, and who, by the way, are the majority of our culture. right? The problem is in the spirit of the meritocracy itself that somehow says the person who's got this white-collar job is a better, more valuable, whatever kind of a person than the blue-collar person. Another book I unfailingly recommend is Matthew Crawford's book, Shop Class as Soulcraft, in which he argues, he just looks more closely at blue-collar work. And he says, if you look at the guy who's fixing your HVAC, that guy has to be actually quite smart to figure out, to diagnose what's going wrong with the machine, to try to figure out, given the way things are configured in this particular house, what's the best way to wire things to make them work. It takes a lot of knowledge and skill to do that, and it's obviously very valuable. He also points out, and I think this is true, it's increasingly the case because there's a scarcity of good HVAC guys that you can make a pretty decent living doing it. And yet we persist. Like I always tell this to my students, and they're all nodding. Oh yes, this sounds really good. And they say, well, show of hands. How many of you want to quit pursuing your college education and go and get training as an HVAC repairman? And they all sit on their hands. And the main reason is because they could never go back to mom and dad and say, Mom, this is what I want to do. Okay. Okay. So it seems to me that while we can worry a lot about the super, super, super rich people, we need to also look a lot harder about what the 20% of us are doing to maintain social distance between us and the rest of the world. Okay, I think that brings me to the end of the talk. Coming back to how can we change the culture? In addition to changing our own selves, I have always found that churches that are economically diverse are much more thriving in a spiritual sense than churches that are socioeconomically divided. There's something about being in community with people across class and economic lines. You want to build up those kinds of communities. I have never known a way to get around this problem. We need to stop thinking in terms of what we can do for them. The people who are in advantage, and I don't know linguistically how to name this problem, but do you hear what I'm saying? People on the bottom have agency, they're real people with real thoughts or whatever, and our whole way of trying to fix the problem for them seems to me to be part of the problem. And we can all think about how we confer status. To the extent that we buy into a culture that confers status based on wealth, we're participating in the problem. So that's my talk. Thank you for your attention.
Well, first, let me thank Michael for the invitation to be here. It's a really a great honor to be here. And as Michael mentioned, my name is Amir Sufi. I'm on the faculty here at Booth. I teach finance, I teach economics, and that's the background that I have. So I do want to give a disclaimer before I go any further that my training is in economics. That's where my PhD is. And I've been doing research on things like inequality for a few years. But I do not have any formal education in theology. I am a consumer of theology for sure. And in that context, I also want to just mention that I come from the Islamic spiritual tradition, and that's where most of my knowledge is. So you may be asking yourself at this point, well, why is he here? Why is he discussing this? And I think the reason is I'm a huge fan of what Professor Hirschfeld's trying to do. And over the 18 years that I've been an economist here at the University of Chicago, I've come to the conclusion, and I may get struck down by Gary Becker somewhere from saying this, but that economics is a beautiful science. It has a lot of power, but it is, at the end of the day, it has its limitations. And it's going to be insufficient for us to use economics alone to try to tackle some of society's biggest issues. And I have not seen a book as good as Professor Hirschfeld's book at really bridging this gap, and that comes from, as Michael was mentioning, this very unique training that she has, that she understands the tools of economics. And most economists, even when I was mentioning some friends that I was going to give this talk, they said, oh, we can model all that stuff in economics, all that stuff that's in theology. And I think Professor Hirschfeld does a great job of showing that that's not the case, that there are fundamental insights coming from theology that we can't learn generally from the economic frameworks that we usually use. And we were having a wonderful conversation before about the dangers of over-specialization. And I think, especially for the younger people in the crowd, I would really, obviously most of us, when we have to go and make a living, we're going to have to specialize to some degree. But especially when we're talking the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of deep truths, it's going to be very hard to come to those if we have a very unique, specialized set of information. And Professor Hirschfeld has done a fantastic job of using her expertise in both economics and theology to make some really deep insights. So it's in that context that hopefully I can add something to what she said, coming from the economics view, but appreciating this attempt to really try to bridge some of the gaps that are between the two fields. So in that context, again, I study income inequality. What do we know about income inequality? We know especially that top income shares have gone up a lot over the last 30 years. The top 1% of the income distribution now commands about 7 to 9 percentage points more of national income than they did 30 years ago. That's from a pre-tax perspective. And I totally agree with Professor Hirschfeld that that might also be a problem in terms of why that's happening, but let's just assume for the sake of argument that that's happening because of technology, because globalization. My perspective on Professor Hirschfeld's essay is that I took away from it, even if that's the case, even if that we think that this rise in income inequality is coming from factors that are unrelated to, say, moral problems, that it presents a lot of dilemmas that we have to face and that we have to kind of think through. So here were the three main takeaways that I took away. Now these of course are subjective. These are the things that I took away. I'm going to focus less on some of the points of marginalization and exploitation of the poor, even though I think those are really important. And I'm more interested in what does this mean for the top 1% themselves? What can we take away from this essay on that? And there were three main points. The first is, I took away, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong when we do the Q&A, that in the Christian tradition, an unequal distribution of income in a society is not by itself a moral evil. That there is an acceptance within the Christian tradition that inequality may be an inherent part of society. And here was a direct quote, just to make sure I have it right. While excessive income inequality is far from ideal from a Christian perspective, it is not obviously an urgent moral question, at least not apart from some other economic concerns that may be more central in the Christian tradition. So that was the first main takeaway. The second takeaway I had was, more inequality can be especially problematic if it is accompanied by a narrow view of individuals as atomistic. Or in other words, if it is accompanied by a failure to see how one's own well-being is attached to others in communities. I love this quote, so I'm just going to quote directly from the essay. The joys of others enhance our own well-being, and by the same token, the sufferings of others diminish our own well-being, making it more natural to look after those in need. That seems to me as close to truth as you get. If you don't agree with that, like, you have to look inside yourself. And I think once you accept that, then you have a different perspective on what income inequality means. The third main takeaway that I had was there is a big danger in believing that the accumulation of wealth in and of itself is a source of happiness. This will make a rise in income inequality. If you combine it with that view, it's going to be especially pernicious for what happens in society. As Professor Hirschfeld said very eloquently, people view any reduction in their own wealth, even charitable giving, they start to view that as a zero-sum game, that I'm made worse off. And I really like the way Professor Hirschfeld is pointing out that a lot of our fundamental ways we speak about inequality or access have that implicit within it, that if I give something from myself, it's some kind of sacrifice. It was actually a very interesting critique of Rawls that I'd never really heard made in that way. I also really like the way in which she's pointing out that once you buy into this idea that my well-being is attached to my accumulation of wealth, it becomes much more acceptable to do things like what's being done in the gambling industry. Or, I oftentimes used to say to some of my students, suppose you were at an alcohol company and you knew you could get the list of addresses of people who were recovering alcoholics. Would you use that list to send alcohol to them? And what would you think of yourself if you were willing to do that? And that's the kind of thing that comes very naturally if you start to view that the accumulation of your own wealth is the source of your happiness and your well-being. So those were the three main takeaways that I had. I thought in my response I would just quickly note that there's actually quite a correspondence with all three ideas in the Islamic tradition. And in fact, if you look at the scripture, it's very evident. 2 of the last 10 chapters of the Quran, those of you who know who the Quran, the last few chapters of the Quran are very short, simple elucidations of main points of theology and belief, and 2 of the last 10 are actually dedicated toward the idea of pursuing wealth as an end in and of itself and the extreme dangers that come of that. So, I mean, that's a very universal idea, I think, are across so many Christian, Islamic, Jewish, a lot of traditions are going to have that in there. But I thought I would also just point to one of our luminaries. Professor Hirschfeld does a great job in talking about St. Thomas Aquinas. A lot of similar ideas are actually in the work of Imam al-Ghazali, and so many of you may know who al-Ghazali is. Al-Ghazali was an 11th century Islamic scholar from Persia. He's kind of a giant in Islamic scholarship on matters of theology, on matters of spirituality, tasawwuf or Sufism as we call it, matters of philosophy. And there's this really excellent book called The Economic Thought of al-Ghazali by Ghazanfar and Islahi, where they go through some of the arguments that Ghazali makes that are very closely connected to Aquinas. And I just appreciated the universality, so I just wanted to quote directly from these. So for example, the authors write that al-Ghazali is critical of any means to force equality of income and wealth in a society. He is also critical on those who insist upon a subsistence level of people living for people generally, even though he himself was quite ascetic and did live a quite ascetic lifestyle. Such an approach may be suitable only for those pious people who only seek the hereafter. It cannot be a prescription for society as a whole. In fact, Ghazali has a fascinating argument about if you get people to believe that they must live a very ascetic lifestyle, everybody. He obviously advocates that some people who have a type of piety that they want to pursue that should be allowed to pursue that. Then you'll get kings that will use that as a justification for taking everyone's wealth, right? So he has that kind of argument. But at the same time, he points out that the whole purpose of inequality, and this is also from the scripture itself in Islam, that inequality may have been decreed by God precisely so that we can find use in one another, that people can find it within themselves to actually give to others. In fact, there's a verse in the Quran in chapter 43 that basically says that God makes us unequal so that we may make ourselves avail to others. That it actually flips the whole logic on its head, that it is that we are a community and emphasizing those ties within the community that then leads us, that makes it wise for God to actually make us unequal, because we can then take opportunities to get to know each other and to help one another. So you can see within this quote from al-Ghazali that there's both the first 2 points, that the notion that there will be inequality is not itself a moral evil, but the notion that there's inequality in a society in which we view each other as atomistic and we're not together, that's quickly going to lead to problems. And the final part of this is he basically says, al-Ghazali maintains that the spirit of Islamic brotherhood, sorry for the gender term, I'm sure it means humanity, requires us to have voluntary sharing of wealth with others. That's what makes us in some sense human. And as I already mentioned, there's a lot in the Islamic tradition about the dangers of accumulating wealth for the sake of wealth. And in fact, this is a direct quote from al-Ghazali that I really love. Man loves to accumulate wealth and increase his possessions of all kinds of property. If he has 2 valleys of gold, he would want to have a 3rd. So there's a recognition there that we do have these tendencies and that religious tradition, training can help us overcome those natural tendencies that we may have. The last thing I want to say in conclusion is I've thought a lot about the issues that arise from inequality and how we go about potentially fixing them. And that's a question of persuasion. And the question of persuasion is one of the most difficult issues. I did high school debate. I remember thinking a lot about like, how do I persuade you that something may be good for you or good for me or whatever. And it's in this context I really want to emphasize the importance of Professor Hirschfeld's work. I have talked to so many of my fellow economists who are trained in the secular liberal way about thinking of the ways of overcoming income inequality. And we immediately go to things like wealth taxes or income taxes. It's just our nature to think that the state must step in and fix these problems. And I can tell you that I've grown more and more skeptical that those things can work. I don't want to discount those completely. you're talking about people oftentimes trained in exactly the ways to evade taxes that you're going to try to attack with these taxes. I mean, do you really think it's going to work in the long run? I'm not saying we should abandon it or we shouldn't try it, but it seems much more compelling. Wouldn't it be nice if we could convince people in the top 1% through the arts of persuasion, probably coming from a theological perspective, that it would be good for them to give, right? I say this to my economist friends and they look at me like I'm crazy. So I'm hoping maybe I get a more sympathetic audience here. But it is an interesting idea to think broadly about what the theological perspective comes in, about how we can persuade people that the rise in income inequality can be problematic, that it might be in their own interest, in the sense of I'm happier if you're happier, to give more wealth, to give more time, to invest in your community, to get to know people, to treat people as human beings that are coming to your house and fixing your stuff. And I think that's one of the big takeaways I take away from Professor Hirschfeld's work. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss this fine work.
And we have plenty of time for questions from the audience. I do ask that you wait for the microphone so our online audience can also hear your questions, and I will also have questions that come from the audience. So is there anyone who wants to get us started? All right, we'll start in the back with Katie, followed by Elisa.
Thank you very much to both of you for your wonderful talk and the great response. I have a question that I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit more about, which is the extent to which our current economic frame is based on this kind of consumer culture. And so it seems to an extent, to a person who knows almost nothing about economics, that a lot of our economic well-being at this stage is based on people buying things they don't need. And a lot of the people whose livelihood is dependent on producing those things are the people in the bottom 80%. Somewhere in there, there's a question. This is a concern that I have, and based on your remarks, I'd just love to hear what you guys have to say about that.
Am I on? Okay. This is the problem that keeps me awake at night. It has ever since I started going down this road. I want to say to us as consumers that we don't need to buy. I mean, just look at the stuff that's in the closet that's like flowing out, the clutter that you have every time you have to move. But the whole economic system is based on producing all this excess material so that people can have jobs. And what I want to say about that. First of all, you could imagine a different equilibrium. The question how we get there is a harder question, but you could imagine a different equilibrium. And it was one that people contemplated as recently as 100 years ago. So John Maynard Keynes was looking at the trajectory of rising productivity, saying, we're soon going to hit a place where everybody has what they need. And then what are we going to do at that point? And he said, well, I guess we're going to have more leisure. And then he takes up the problem of how are we going to, we should start educating people to use their leisure well or something. So the question about why we chose this other path, where we all keep working as hard, if not harder, than we used to, why do we still have 40-hour work weeks when we could have a 10-hour work week? It suggests that there's something more going on here than just we want more stuff. So it's a complicated problem. And the other thing I want to say is I also tend to just sort of trust in God's providence. If we were to come into right relationship with wealth, things would sort themselves out. It's easy to diagnose all the problems that come from our lack of a right relationship with wealth. We can see how massive they are. That said, if I convinced you all in today's talk that we should all just start wanting to chew aspirin, right? In some sense, we would give the excess away, so that money would still be spent, that would all be fine. But presumably some air would come out of the balloon on the economy, and that might have bad consequences. So that's my lame answer.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. The one, this is the opportunity for me to air some of my thoughts that are kind of non-conventional in economics. I've always thought to myself that like if you had people with kind of, in economics, we never want to make judgments about what people consume. That's just how we work, right? We take preferences given. Actually, Professor Hirschfeld's written fantastically about this, that's a limitation. We're not really able to say whether you're better off or worse off when you consume something. We're only able to say, we think you're better off because you chose to consume it. So imagine a society in which people shape, either through religion or through something else, start to think seriously about what they consume. I don't know, maybe I'm overly optimistic. It's not obvious to me that you couldn't still get like economic growth and you couldn't get production. Like, I think there are things that everybody wishes they had that would even be good for them, but that requires me to take a stand on what's good for you, right? Which takes me out of the realm of economics. So it's not economists that can answer that. I think of things like community. So I swim with a group at the Point, and we oftentimes go to Rue Cafe to have breakfast together. That's clearly good for all of us. We enjoy it. We get to know each other. There's people from all different backgrounds. I love going to see them, and we're there and we're spending money at Rue, right? So I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that we couldn't do it. It's about kind of reorganizing what we think is good consumption. But again, I'm not an expert in that area to think about that question.
If I could, that prompts another train of thought that I've often harbored. Part of our move to this path was we got industrialization that allowed us to make a lot of products cheaply. And on the one hand, that means more people have plates and things like that. But now that we have that kind of wired so that everybody has enough of those things, there was always a trade-off. When we switched to mechanized production, we got standardized products that tend to be made in certain ways or whatever. There's room for us to go back to a more expensive mode of production that would be more personalized. I'm like, speaking for myself, I don't like buying clothes off the rack. Why can't I find a tailor who would say, given your coloring and your configuration, this is the thing that would look good on you, let me make it for you. And notice that it's labor intensive, but it would, and the work on the other side, it seems to me, would also be more meaningful because it would be a craft. That might be utopian, but that's one direction that my brain goes on that.
So thank you so much for a great talk. It had lots of interesting ideas. I have a comment and a question. So first, the comment. Just wanted to say I loved your shift of perspective. So whenever we think of poor people and inequality, we think, oh, we should make a sacrifice and give something. And you're kind of saying, well, maybe the first thing you should do is go and meet these people, hang out with them, figure out they might actually be very cool people, and then you'll see a space maybe to do something for them, but like kind of starting from meeting those people, and I really like this point. The question I had is like, as an economist, I think how much of the ideas that you conveyed in the talk can we actually adopt into the field of economics? Is it a hopeless thing, or is there hope for this? And I have two thoughts I wanted to share and hear your perspective. I think one issue, which is maybe less deep than the other one, is that, okay, so when we model our choice of how much to work, we have consumption and leisure. So we value both. And so as economists, we are not just saying we want to pursue just consuming more. So we are able to model the fact that we don't just care about consumption, we care also about leisure. So in a way, like, I could take your argument to say, well, we could add, like, as part of leisure or as part of these other things that we care about is like giving or like philanthropy or these kind of things. I think the one issue with this is that with like modeling this is that it's hard to measure. Like GDP is easy, it's just like the value of consumption. It's already hard to measure the value of leisure. It's even harder to say, well, the GDP of like, maybe Italy is higher than the GDP of the US because I'm making this up. Because like maybe Italian people are more philanthropic. Like you're never gonna see it in the national statistic, and somehow as economists we kind of care about measuring stuff. So I think that might be one obstacle. But I think another obstacle is like a lot of the things that you have said, I think ultimately rely to what I would say is like a very personal experience, which could be even a personal encounter with God. And I think that's like the thing that is like just very hard to incorporate in any like, I don't know how to say, more materialistic or like scientific based model. So yeah, these were the two thoughts when I tried to say, okay, as an economist, can I incorporate any of your ideas in my work, or like, yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
So, I don't know if I made this clear or not. Economics has a lot of value to offer people. It understands how markets work. It's very valuable. Did I turn this on? Am I on? Okay. So I don't think economists should pack up their bags and go do something else by any stretch of the imagination. But Professor Sufi underscored one of the things that I think is central is we need to move consciously in the direction of more interdisciplinary work. Economists have really important insights into these issues, but they're not the only insights that are available, right? So, and I don't know how to work that into the current academic structure where there's so much pressure to publish, and publishing means thinking the way, doing the things that economists do with the tools economists have. But once you see that that specialization is cutting you off from being able to actually effectively engage the world as it is, it feels like there should be room for people to start moving in the direction of generating these interdisciplinary kinds of studies. In my book, another thing that I stress besides my deep desire to see more interdisciplinary work on these kinds of issues is that economists should recognize that they have a tool, but they need to recognize that there's limits to the tool. So as you said, a lot of the things we might care about are not measurable. And from an economist's point of view, that means it's not there. And what you could say instead is, I've reached the limit of what I can say, but I can see that there's something there that's not measurable. And maybe that's the path towards opening up the doors to this other kind of interdisciplinary research.
All right, so I'm going to bring two questions from the online audience that are related. First, Sarah Aponte Olivieri says, thank you for this wonderful talk. Can you talk more about the role of charity as both love and material sharing in a more humane economy? And then related to that first part of charity is love, Timothy Little says, you've mentioned Robert Putnam several times tonight. If we as society or the church were to increase social capital in all its forms, linking, bridging, and bonding, would those efforts help to alleviate economic inequality?
It feels to me like both those questions answer themselves. One thing that worries me about our materialism is to the extent that we think of charity solely in terms of how much money should people give to each other, we're still prioritizing the material stuff and we're underemphasizing the effort to build community across social lines, which I think is our real path out. So, and the second question, can you prompt me?
Was whether increasing social capital in the sense of Robert Putnam would help decrease economic inequality.
Here I'm just going to speak out of my own experience, but I expect it resonates. If you know people, right, first of all, you care about them as human beings and stuff, and then if you hear that they have a certain need, it's just I mean, if you got a good friend and your friend all of a sudden needs $500 to repair a car, you're going to loan them and or give them the money to do that, right, really without thinking about it. The more people you know, the more agency room you'll have for building up these connections where you can help one another. I've come across several communities that are more organized around these principles, where one person will say, I had a bad year and my neighbors helped me out, and then I'm standing ready to help them out in a bad year. The market has replaced a lot of those connections, but it seems to me that we could be intentional about rebuilding those communities, at least in principle, and the social capital would do a lot. The other thing the social capital does is it would take away the edge from the invidious part of the comparisons. So I don't know him, and I may be using a bad person as an example, but it seems to me that Warren Buffett, at least the idea of Warren Buffett, is kind of an example of this. Warren Buffett, of course, has a ton of money. He also, as of the last time I was in Omaha, was still living in a neighborhood where his house was with, he was in a neighborhood with people next door. His house was probably a little bit better than everybody else's. And this is going back to the Putnam idea. If the rich have this idea that they're still part of the community and are connected with the people around them, there's a voluntary choice to live down, not live down, but the standards are going to be lower to just keep you in shouting distance of your neighbors, right? If you were driving down the street where he lives, you would not notice that his was the house on that block. And in that sense, I think, and if we move to that, I think then it would be a lot harder to think, well, how can I how can I exploit these other people out here so that I can puff myself up? And I think it would just leaven the problem a lot.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that it seems that if you look at surveys of social well-being, self-reported well-being, you know, surveys where you ask people, are they happy? How do they think about their lives? How do they think about the future of their children? Economists oftentimes don't put much stock in those. I put stock in those. I think they're very useful, actually. They oftentimes find the highest predictors of happiness in these subjective well-being type of studies are actually religion, religious belief, and also like whether you've had a meaningful conversation with someone in the last 2 weeks or something. I mean, it's pretty overwhelming in these surveys that people seem happier when they have close friendships. And although it's not in the surveys, I imagine it's close friendships that are not for the purpose of me accelerating my career. It's like real close friendships, right? And so then as an economist, we would always ask ourselves, well, why don't we see people just self-selecting into communities and forming social capital? Like, what's the problem? And there I would point to the research of my colleague Nick Epley, who many of you have seen, which he's just pointing out a pretty simple fact that I think once you hear it, you realize for most of us it is true, which is we systematically underestimate how much we're going to enjoy talking with people. Like, we get on a plane and we think, oh, I don't want the person next to me to talk to me. And we get on a bus, and he systematically documents this in his book and in his research that that's a systematic bias we have. We systematically underestimate how much happier it'll make us to talk with people. And so if you get that and then you get market economy that's going to exploit that, it's going to be you're actually happy on this app called Twitter where you're just sitting, you're going to be happier doing that than going out and talking to people. You might fall for it, even though in the long run you're going to be like, what have I done? I don't have any friends anymore, right? And so I think you can get into these environments in which you get into this trap, and it requires like thinking through your life, and it requires like thinking through things to make sure you don't fall into that trap. So that's why my social capital you might think is declining, even though we're all worse off for it.
Yeah. So thank you both for this really thoughtful talk and follow-up. And my question kind of builds on this discussion of social capital, because Professor Hirschfeld, you brought up two really really significant problems: atomization and exclusion. And I'm wondering if you see a possibility for solutions to the former that don't intensify the latter. Because it seems like a way that you deal with atomization is through forming strong group identities. And which is great in many ways, but these strong group identities, whether it's national or ethnic or religious, also hold out the possibility for creating new forms of exclusion, exploitation, invidious comparisons. So is that, obviously that's a really difficult problem, but do you think that is truly an insoluble problem? Do these traditions that you've thought through hold out the possibility of dealing with atomization without intensifying exclusion?
Yeah, that's actually a profound problem. Robert Putnam got a lot of blowback for idealizing this community in 1950s Ohio exactly on these lines. That may have been a well-knit community across economic dividers. It was also almost certainly all white. With all the invidious comparisons that go along there. And what I want, this is where I am going to put on my theologian's hat. We're fallen. Human beings are fallen. And I think you need to always bear that in mind. Any given social configuration will have addressed one problem, but because of our fallen nature, it will have introduced a new form of problems. And so in some sense, the rise of meritocracy and all that was actually largely about trying to open up to get past those old forms of exclusion, and then now they're creating a new form of exclusion. And I think because we're finite and we're in our time, what we need to do is lean back against what is the current ill. So I would want to lean back to that. But it would be really important to bear in mind always that humans do like to scapegoat, they like to otherize. I mean, and we've been doing that since the dawn of history. But I think you always, in your place and time, want to work in the direction of making it better. And right now, I think it looks along the lines that I talked about.
All right, I have a question over here.
Dr. Hirschfeld, you talked about large numbers of students wanting to go into finance to make a lot more money. You know, we're Americans. We want to live the American dream. We have an American way of life. Would you each comment on how, if the American dream has changed and shifted and absorbed that financialization and this, and the issues you've raised over time? You did talk about it, changes at Goldman Sachs. Has that permeated the culture now, where to be an American is to strive to win?
When I got to that phase of the talk, it was kind of, you couldn't hear the pleading in my voice. I want people to investigate that. I really want cultural historians to go in and look at what's been going on over the last 30 or 40 years. From my armchair, I can pick these examples and I can say, it feels like something is going on. But I'm sure there's really interesting research to be done about exactly what it is. So somebody here, take up the torch and go do that research, and then send me your book, because I want to know the answer. So,
I mean, I'll just say, for one example I was thinking through is this nice research paper by Carola Friedman and Royven Sachs. It's a specific issue, but you'll see the broader point, hopefully, which is on CEO compensation, which is, of course, a huge hot topic, that CEOs are paid so much more today than they were 50, 60 years ago. And it's kind of an amazing, it's amazing almost capitulation. They probably wouldn't like me to say that, but you know, they do all this analysis. They're historians, so they go back and they get the data all the way to the 1920s. They follow it, and they do all this intensive analysis, and they come to the conclusion that if you look at the rise in CEO pay since about the 1980s, about the same time period, they can't explain it. Basically, we can't explain it. It must be something cultural. You know, I think it's very funny. It's like the last line of the economics article. We can't do it. Hand it off to somebody else, right? And so maybe that's what we need, somebody else to come in. Because it wasn't like you could explain it through, you know, managerial incentives or through returns to education or anything else. It was just CEOs decided in the 1980s they didn't have any problem paying themselves more. And we don't know why. And so I think that's where we do need a lot more research.
All right, so we have two final questions, and I'm just going to have them both go. And so please jot down your notes so you can keep track of the questions, but so we can get everyone in.
Hi, thank you both so much. I feel like what the truths that you are sharing, you know, about thinking of economies that center caring make a lot of sense when thinking about, you know, how I as a person should be changing my own social habits. My question is around kind of this issue of scale, and I'm going to struggle to try to totally put it into words what I'm trying to ask here, but there seems to, I guess my question is, do you find that there is something paradoxical about, you know, building economies of scale, that so much of our industries today are oriented towards getting larger? And if that, then does that harm our ability to think about what are the actual human personal truths that should be ordering the way that we live our economic lives? And so, you know, the matter of social capital, it seems to be a cap on the number of people at any one time that you can actually care about, even like almost like psychologically. And, you know, I'm a Booth student here, and I think a lot of our, it seems it's almost inevitable that everything is going to get bigger, the way that we consume our food, our clothing, you know, how we do our finances, everything's oriented towards getting larger, which makes the concept of caring, it seems, also harder. So my large question is, what's the issue of scale? Is there like a moral like cap on scale, you think, as well?
So a moral cap on scale, and a final question.
Alrighty. So my question is, so if you got like a spectrum from like really pure market capitalism to like very strict communism, on that kind of spectrum, what for you, what is the most morally just like way on that spectrum would be the most moral for you guys?
A great classic Catholic social thought question. So
Okay, I'm gonna dive in because these are both actually really important questions to me. Can we have the kind of good society I talked about in a mass society with 330 million people and counting in America alone or so on? And especially since a lot of what I want to talk about is how people in business should think about the economy the way I'm talking about and create more humane businesses and so on. And I really love all that stuff. And then I look at corporate America going, how does that have any purchase? For me, that's a live question. I just took this job to move to Notre Dame, partly because I'll have an affiliation with the business school there. And I'm hoping that by being in touch with the business school, I'll have a chance to start learning more about actually what goes on in corporate America and so on and so forth. But from the external perspective, it seems, I don't know a path out because the pressures towards that large scale are huge, and I don't think they stop. But it also does seem to me that it leads to less human interaction all the way up and down the chain. And I floated this idea at lunch. It feels to me like we may have been already past peak wealth in the real sense. My experience as a consumer in this culture is that the firms are not responding to me very well anymore. I don't feel like I'm being as well served by them anymore because I don't think I'm visible to them as a human being because they're these massive how do you say this word, bureaucratized structures. I certainly see that in the academy, the growing bureaucratization of things. And it seems to me like it's a social, I don't know what the answer is. I will say that Aquinas, who I draw on, El-Ghazali, all these people are talking from a world where there's a lot smaller scale. And it may just be that we humans are meant to flourish on a smaller scale. And if that's the case, things that cannot continue won't. And we might see we might be heading to a civilizational disaster. Or I'm completely wrong and we'll figure out how to make it work. I don't know how that will go. To the question about what's the most just economic situation, should we have communism or capitalism? I like the Catholic path, which is the answer is neither. Part of the reason why I really, really emphasize the formation of economic virtue, trying to understand the true value of wealth better, is it seems to me if you don't ask that question, whichever way you go on that scale is going to lead to dehumanizing bad outcomes. And I don't want to have any part of that discussion. I am open to the possibility that something like democratic socialism in Europe that you see there is more conducive towards forming people who have better values. That's entirely possible. But I don't know. So I'm speaking mostly to Americans, and so I'm saying, get some religion. So.
I think that you would agree with me that this is a very rich conversation, and we've all walked away, I think, with a little more wealth in our intellectual treasure house today. I want to extend a word of gratitude for you all for coming here tonight, for the Booth School of Business and Catholics at Booth for hosting us in this fantastic space, for Credo for continuing to ferment conversations like these, and just being a representation that you can be an economist and a person of faith and care about more humane economies. For the John Templeton Foundation for helping fund today's conversation. But I would be remiss if I didn't invite you to join me in thanking our speakers for an excellent conversation.